Welcome to our webinar. My name is Claire Weiner. I am a senior associate here at RMI on our carbon-free electricity program, and I am excited to welcome you all to our webinar today, Mind the Regulatory Gap, breaking down RMI's new report on how to enhance local transmission oversight. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can during a live Q&A. This webinar will be an hour long. We'll start off with a brief presentation from me providing an overview of our new report, Mind the Regulatory Gap, How to Enhance Local Transmission Oversight. Then we'll move into a panel discussion with our 3 expert guest speakers who we are thrilled to have join us today. This is where we'll be drawing on questions from you all that you submit via the Q&A function. I'll introduce our panelists in more detail when we transition to the panel, but here is a sneak peek at who we have joining us. Kent Chandler, who is a resident senior fellow with the R Street Institute. Anjali Patel, who is the vice president for clean energy at Gardiner and Associates. And Greg Poulos, the executive director of the Consumer Advocates of the PJM States. But first, I'm going to start with a brief overview of some of the key findings of our new report. So the context for the report is this. Consumer bills for transmission in the U.S. have been rising rapidly in recent years. Data from RMI's Utility Transition Hub has illustrated that over the past 2 decades, transmission and distribution now makes up 24% of residential bill spend, compared to 10% in 2005. Moreover, a Grid Strategies report from earlier this year found that transmission spending hit an all-time high in 2023. Now, this trend is not in and of itself a bad thing. As we explain in our report, we as a country need to be spending more on our grid today to meet the dual demands of rising load growth and integrating new generation resources. But at the same time that the costs of transmission have been rising, we've seen fewer and fewer dollars spent on high voltage transmission. The figure on the right comes from our report and illustrates data from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that shows that increasingly, the portion of dollars spent on high voltage transmission in the U.S. has been declining from 72% in 2014 on projects above 230 kilovolts to 34% in 2021. Related research has found that the U.S. added only 20% as many line miles of transmission in the early 2020s compared to a decade prior in the early 2010s, and that 90% of recent transmission spend has been on lower voltage reliability upgrades. This is highly concerning, as with all the growing demands on the grid we are seeing today, from load growth to backlogged interconnection queues for new generation resources, the last thing we need to be seeing is a decline in more new high voltage transmission. So why is it that while overall transmission costs have been rising, the U.S. is actually investing less in high voltage assets and new line miles? Well, one explanation, which is the whole premise of this report, is that utilities have been investing more in local transmission, which tends to be built at a lower voltage level. Here on this slide, we define the difference between local and regional transmission. Local transmission refers to projects that are planned and built by a single utility to meet needs within that utility's footprint. Regional transmission refers to projects that are planned at the regional level by what are called regional planning entities, which cover almost the entire U.S. and may span multiple utilities' footprints. Now, why does this distinction matter? Well, oftentimes regional transmission can address the region's entire needs in a more efficient and cost-effective manner. Local transmission, on the other hand, is planned by the single utility with no insights into broader regional needs. It's an inherently inefficient way to build out the grid of the future. To meet the pressing needs the grid is facing today, we'll want to be investing more in high-voltage regional solutions. Yet, as we illustrate on this slide, utilities in recent years have actually been investing significantly more in local transmission, not regional. And these are some examples on this slide. In the Mid-Atlantic, or PJM, spending on local projects increased 26-fold from 2009 to 2023. In New England, or ISO New England, spending on local projects increased 8-fold from 2016 to 2023. In the Midwest, or MISO, the spending on local projects increased from 54% of all spending in 2017 to 78% in 2022. And in California, or CAISO, 63% of all transmission spend was on local projects from 2018 to 2022. Now, why are utilities investing more in local transmission when regional transmission has a greater potential to enhance the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the grid? In our report, and this is where the title of the report comes from, we attribute this shift in spending to what is called a regulatory gap. The graphic on this slide, which may be a little small for you all, but if you go and download our report, you can see it in greater detail, illustrates the regulatory gap in action. Typically, transmission will receive oversight at the state, regional, and federal levels. But due to a simultaneous evolution of regulatory loopholes, local transmission can effectively avoid regulatory review at the state, regional, and federal levels, enabling it to get built with very little oversight. So at the state level, for instance, state public utility commissions, or PUCs, often exempt local projects from receiving a state-level permit, what's called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or a CPCN, because local projects are often low voltage or may comprise infrastructure rebuilds on existing right-of-ways, where the PUC has historically assumed that such projects don't require state-level scrutiny, especially from a siting and permitting perspective. On the regional level, the regional planning entity frequently claims that local projects are outside of their purview because they are local, not regional. And at the federal level, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, uses a rate-making structure that does not require project-level scrutiny. And so most local projects receive virtually automatic rate approval. The result is that local projects are typically able to be proposed and built with very little oversight. This can in part explain why we've seen spending shift in the US in recent years to local transmission. It's simply easier to get it built and get paid for it. So, and this is my last slide before we pivot to the panel, what do we do about it? In our paper, we give 11 recommendations for actions that can be taken at the regional, federal, and state levels to help to close the gap. I'll quickly summarize them here, but I encourage you all to go download the report to get a deeper understanding of the solution space. First, on the regional level, we can start by implementing what we call regional first planning. We explain in the paper what this means, but it essentially refers to changing the way local projects are considered today to first look at how regional projects could holistically meet local and regional needs, and then build any local projects necessary to meet remaining local needs. FERC could require regional first planning of all regional planning entities, or regional planning entities could implement it on their own. Second, on the regional level, regional planning entities can standardize local project definitions and tracking to make it easier for state regulators to keep tabs on local transmission investments over time. Currently, many regions have each utility using different terms for their local projects. That can be confusing for state regulators, especially in states that may have multiple utilities within their footprint. Regional planning entities should also make data on local transmission investments public and easily accessible with a sufficient level of detail. FERC could require standardization and data sharing across regional planning entities, or entities could do it on their own. Third, on the regional level, regional planning entities can strengthen opportunities for state input and influence in regional planning processes. This could include giving states an advisory vote on transmission plans, giving states a formal vote in the stakeholder process, or assisting state regulators and consumer advocates with forming regional organizations to represent their collective interests across the planning region. Consumer Advocates of the PJM States, Greg's organization, is one example of that. On the federal level, FERC can first reform its rate-making process, which follows a formula rate structure that does not currently enable significant project-level scrutiny. FERC could implement changes to enable greater scrutiny of local projects, and we explore the specifics more in the paper. Second, FERC could also consider establishing an independent transmission monitor, either at the regional or national level, to provide state regulators and consumer advocates with greater knowledge of transmission investment spending trends and possible efficiencies. And third, FERC could explore performance-based regulation for transmission. We explain more in the report what that is, what it could look like, but one example could involve reducing the utility's rate of return for local transmission and maintaining it or increasing it for regional transmission to incentivize investing more in regional solutions. And finally, on the state level, state legislatures can first expand Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or CPCN, authorities to give state PUCs greater oversight authority into local projects. CPCNs are state-level permits that transmission projects often get, and as I said earlier, local projects are often exempted from receiving them. State legislatures could explore how to ensure that local projects are still required to submit documentation to PUCs without creating an overly burdensome process. We discuss more in the report on how this could be implemented. Second, states can offer expedited cost recovery for local projects that have undergone a robust regional review. We explain this mechanism in more detail in the report, including a case study of a state, Kansas, that has successfully done this. But this mechanism effectively creates a positive incentive through rates for utilities to submit their local projects to regional planning entities to undergo a robust regional review. Third, states can update their IRPs, or integrated resource plans, to include transmission. We explain more in the report what IRPs are and how transmission is largely excluded from them to date, missing a key opportunity for more efficient and least cost planning. Fourth, states can create what are known as electric transmission authorities. There are a few states in the US that have such an authority, including Colorado and New Mexico, and this entity can be used to coordinate state-level transmission expansion planning to maximize cost efficiencies, which we explain more in the report. And finally, states can increase regulatory staff capacity and expertise to enable greater review of these local projects. We recognize that greater allocation of resources can be challenging, but we believe that such a trade-off is ultimately valuable to maximize efficient spend of consumer dollars. So with that, I know that was a lot of content, so we appreciate you all listening up to this point. I am now going to transition us to the panel portion of this webinar. Please continue to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of those during the panel as possible. For our panel, we are thrilled to welcome first Kent Chandler, who is a resident senior fellow in energy and environmental policy at the R Street Institute. Kent previously held notable positions, including executive director and later chairman of the Kentucky Public Service Commission, as well as assistant attorney general in the Kentucky Office of Rate Intervention, where he advocated on behalf of consumers on energy and utility issues. Second, we have Anjali Patel, who is the Vice President for Clean Energy at Gardiner and Associates. Her work focuses on providing companies, organizations, and governments with strategic guidance on policies that are needed to support their climate goals. Before joining DGA, Anjali served as the litigation supervisor at the Office of the People's Counsel for the District of Columbia, where she represented consumers before PJM and in federal and state proceedings. And third, we have Greg Poulos, the executive director of the Consumer Advocates of the PJM States, which is a nonprofit organization whose members represent over 61 million consumers in the 13 PJM states and the District of Columbia. Prior to CAPS, Greg served in numerous other roles in the energy space, including Assistant Consumers Counsel at the Office of the Ohio Consumers Counsel. So with that, it looks like we have all our panelists with us. Thank you all for joining us, and I want to hop straight into the discussion. Although feel free to briefly introduce yourself at the start of your response to this first question. So my first question to you all is, from your perspective, why is the regulatory gap such a critical issue facing the transmission space today? And in other words, why should everyday consumers care? And I'll let whoever wants to hop in first go first.
That's Greg, can you hear me? I'll hop in. Great. Thank you, Claire, for putting this panel together, and the report. I think it's excellent. I've been the executive director for CAPS since 2017, and this from the start has been one of the core issues, the fundamental concerns for the consumer advocates in the PJM region, is kind of looking at these costs and this issue and trying to figure it out. I think you've done a great job of capturing it. And I think even today, almost every month we see something new that happens that brings a spotlight to this issue. And even recently, there's a FERC order against public service electric and gas company that came out. There's more baseline projects in our region, but certainly that kind of brings a lot of these things to light as well. So it's certainly front and center. And for us, number one, it's a cost issue. The regulatory gap represents the gray area in the regional consumer bill, and that's really the local transmission spend, as you've kind of put out in your report. And that gap has continued to grow. And not only has it grown, but really in the PJM region, where the markets do such a great job, have done such a great job over the last decade of keeping prices relatively low for customers. This gap, this gray area, has been one area that has eluded that has gone in a different direction. It's expanded over 100% in the last I think 10 years. So it's really been a question and a concern for us. How do we address it? How do we evaluate it? So we've really taken some efforts to evaluate it, and we really can't. The PJM opportunities in the PJM stakeholder process just aren't there. We get, as stakeholders, we get a sticker price. So we are given a sticker price for projects of, like, say, 30 million or 3 million or 10 million, and that is it. And we cannot get anything further. We cannot get another level of cost. We can't get any information. We can ask questions. They do not have to be answered. And that is the extent of what we've seen for the most part from both the operator, or from the transmission owners, and even from PJM on this. So PJM kind of pushes everything to the transmission operators. Number two, I think really the bigger concern for me personally is it's a reliability issue. Right now, we're talking about the lack of monetary accountability in this area. But when does it switch to a reliability accountability? And that's really something that I think about a lot, because in 2018, when we had the Camp Fire out in California, that really had one of the worst wildfires in the history of California, both from tragedy, from deaths, and from loss of real estate and everything. That came out to the Emily Blunt's California Burning article, The Fall of Pacific Gas and Electric, and really how the investor-owned utilities, their focus, one of their key focuses is profits, and that hinder their ability to really look at the investment in transmission, and how, in a lot of ways, your oversight from your regulators was captured in that they relied too much on the transmission owners who had all the information. And I think in our area, we've even kind of taken that to the next step of being not just regulatory capture, but quasi-regulatory capture, because PJM is not a regulator, but they too, we've seen, are reticent to just sit there and take what the transmission owner says for their word. So those are really some of the core. The other thing you mentioned, I would certainly agree with this. I think that as we look at where PJM is going and the need for a more regional grid, it's hard to see how we get there to be a more cost-effective and efficient grid when there is such an incentive for the investor-owned utilities to put all their money and energy into the local transmission, where there is such a gray area for oversight, and there is such a monetary incentive to keep building in this area as opposed to find more efficient grids. So I'll leave it there, but it's certainly, you've done an excellent job in putting this report together, and I'm pushing it to as many of the advocates and many other folks as I can to say this is the state and the biggest concern we have right now.
I'll jump in next. I think the other issue is that there's so much change that's going on in the grid right now. And so we have aging facilities in much of the nation. Some of the transmission facilities are 50 or 60 years old. The baseload fossil plants were built over 50 years ago. They're beyond their useful life. And so we have this sea change of our existing traditional facilities are aging out. We need to replace them, but we've got different needs for the system. We've got this growing need for electricity, for electrification, for industrial uses, for manufacturing, for data centers, all economic engines for our society. And we don't have a grid that can meet those changing needs. We need to build that grid. And the way we do it has to be cost effective, because all of us on the call are ratepayers. And everybody's a ratepayer in one way, because we need electricity to run our lives. And you also have to get medicine and food and get your kids to school. Those all cost money. And a lot of people don't have, their energy burden is already high. They can't pay their energy bills. If we're going to stack on ineffective costs, it's going to make it harder and harder for them to access this essential service. You can't really run your life without electricity these days. And so this regulatory gap it's important to address, because if we don't, we're potentially spending money in the wrong way. And part of the problem is it's a cost issue, like Greg said, but it's also a trust issue. Some of those local lines are needed because the system is aging and we need to modernize and maintain the system, but we don't know that unless there's information and oversight to ensure that the choices that are being selected are the right ones. And so until we get that transparency, it's very hard for customers or for others to trust that we're putting the right investment into the system. But I'd echo Greg on saying thank you for putting this panel together, and thank you for the great paper. I think it really is helpful and beneficial in shedding light on this issue.
Yeah, Claire, and thanks for getting the three of us together. If you think we're getting in trouble today, you should have seen the days where the three of us were all with cats at the exact same time. So, yeah, I think it's a good question. Why should people care? I'm going to stick to the dollars and cents here for a second, because we're not talking about a jurisdictional gap at all. We're talking about a gap in oversight. This is not a situation to where a state couldn't take care of their state jurisdictional issue, or that FERC couldn't do more on prudency reviews or cost recovery. These are all conscious decisions that legislatures or policymakers or regulators have made. And they're conscious decisions that are negatively affecting consumers today. So that's the first thing. Like, this isn't something that's going to take a constitutional amendment to fix. This is just something that people can, and some of these things just do a better job of the job that they're tasked to do. It matters because customers care about their electric bill at the end of the month. They don't care about the rates. They don't care about if it's a 70% transmission and 20% generation, 10% distribution, or some other combination to equal that total bill. They care about their bill at the end of the month, and they care that they pay their bill and they can afford to pay their bill, and that their lights work when they need them to. And we have electric systems where all of the pieces are tied together. You need the transmission and the distribution and the generation to work. But the backside of that, the accounting side of that, is just as the systems are dependent, the pieces of the system are dependent on each other, so are the costs. And so, I think back to the rate making days. You don't need to pay meter readers anymore, or certainly not like you would have before with old dumb meters that you needed to read once a month. If you switch over to smart meters that tell you every 15 seconds how much electricity has been used. But you've got to make sure that you're accounting for those dependencies and those interactions. And at the end of the day, you've got to make sure that you're able to utilities have to provide these services at the lowest cost. And largely, especially in the Mid-Atlantic region, but largely across the country, regulators have either had their hands tied for them by their legislatures, or have thrown up their hands and actually looking at how some of these costs are incurred. And it matters because the entities that are incurring those costs all have captive customers. There are options for consumers. So if somebody goes and spends, if my local gas station down the street starts spending willy-nilly and tries to pass that on to me, that's fine. I'm just not going to stop there anymore. I'm going to go to the next place. But we're talking about monopoly entities with customer bases that have no alternatives. And so all of these entities have a profit motive, and all of their profits are a function of how much they invest. So it matters because we've effectively set up systems that gives them an incentive to do what they are intending to do, which is maximize those profits. And it's happening with effectively little to no oversight in many of these places. And I hear oftentimes, well, this state made that decision, those customers, that tough luck, right? Well, yes, I guess, but also I continue to be told that we live in a society with a limited amount of capital. So insofar as that money is going into these very inefficient local transmission needs, that money is not available to be put into more efficient investments on the transmission system, on the distribution system, in the generation system. Now, I've not necessarily seen a utility run out of money yet, but that's what they all say when they come in and are seeking higher and higher returns on equity, is that there's a limited amount of capital and there's a lot of competition for it. And so if we have a limited amount of capital, let's put it where we get the biggest bang for our buck. And so that's why it really matters, is I don't think, when it gets back to trust, which Anjali was mentioning earlier, I don't think that anybody can say that any of us have enough information to say with any level of certainty that we're getting our money's worth with the investments that are being made. And it shouldn't be on us to have to prove the negative there on why we're not getting the best money. These are regulated entities, and the burden from the beginning started with them on telling us why they were investing money to the ultimate benefit or the greatest benefit to consumers, and we've completely gotten away from that. And I think it's time to get back to basics.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for sharing with that. I heard a lot of themes from my presentation and our report around lack of oversight, lack of transparency, lack of trust. Kind of thinking across those themes, in our report, we contain a number of different recommendations on what we can do to close the gap, and you all probably have your own additional ideas too. So I'm curious, from each of your perspectives, what can and should be done today by either FERC, the regional planning entities, state PUCs, state consumer advocates, all of the above, to help to close this gap? Kind of what are maybe either low-hanging fruit or recommendations that you would prioritize? And we can go in a different order if we want, or...
No, I'll go first this time. The answer is, how much time do you have? I think everybody needs to do something. I made a comment the other day, and I got taken a little bit out of context, but it was that nobody's baby is the cutest, but there are things you can do to make your baby cuter. Nobody is doing this perfectly. That's the first thing we need to acknowledge. Like, we all have room for improvement here at the RTOs, the utilities, consumer advocates, everybody does. And so there's a laundry list, and I think you all have a great start at them. I think the first thing is that utilities and FERC do is occasionally say no when the utility brings things that are not fully baked, right? Not that it may not have been prudent, not that it may not have been reasonable, but that they haven't proven those things. Occasionally, a little moral hazard goes a long way in ensuring that folks are making the right decisions. CPCNs, expanding CPCN obligations is important, but it's not enough. If you're waiting until a CPCN shows up to understand how a utility is getting to its decision-making, it's oftentimes too late. So you have this real issue with CPCNs for transmission, where a utility is bringing you a solution to a need that they identified. You still need to, as a regulator, understand how they're determining those needs. What criteria are they using? Are they using it consistently to identify needs? Or are they cherry picking things that they think are less risky or that they'll make more money off of? How are they prioritizing needs? Are they jumping ahead? One thing that I would recommend that retail regulators look at is the way that PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, looks at pipeline risk ranking. they require, defined, transparent criteria that these local gas distribution utilities and interstate pipelines have to use to determine risk and safety issues. They have a yearly ranking of those riskiest pipes. And regulators know you need to be taking care of these in something that looks like the order of risk. Utilities don't have that at all. And that's not something that's required or expected at the wholesale level or the retail level. It sounds like or seems like that's where FERC was attempting to try to get to with these end of life determinations with Order 1920, so that maybe these utilities can sort of have to identify needs a little further out to determine whether more efficient solutions can occur. But you've got to make sure you understand how the utilities are identifying these things before they're bringing them to regulators for approval, because oftentimes it's too late. The only thing a utility regulator can do at that point is to say no, but you're not necessarily, by saying no, getting more efficient investment long term. You're just, swatting down the occasional bad project.
Yeah, and I'd add to I'll keep going in the middle. I'm a middle child, so this makes sense. To get that, you need more transparency. To understand what's happening, we need more transparency and informed transparency, not just data dumps of this is what we're doing. PJM actually, ironically, has one of the most open processes through its M3 process, where utilities do come and share, here's what our plan is for a local line, but they don't have to answer the questions of stakeholders. They don't have to change anything in that process. So it's really more of a, here's what we're doing and take it as it is, versus an informed, meaningful process where people can ask questions, get answers, find out whether that is the best alternative. It doesn't always mean, I think there's sometimes a fear that if you provide information, it's just going to be fodder for parties to say no or for stakeholders to say no. I think that the reverse is actually true. I remember when I used to litigate distribution cases, we'd sometimes get these transmission or infrastructure portfolios that were big books of all the things, different plans the utility had. Some of them looked kind of scary. As an attorney, I don't know what goes into these. They're big dollar numbers. But our engineer could look behind the curtain and say, you know what, out of these 7 projects, these 5 make sense. These 2, we need to look at other alternatives. We don't have that information about what alternatives are utilities and regulator and planners looking at. What alternatives are regulators considering? Order 1920 requires the consideration of alternative transmission technologies, which is great, but it can't be a check the box exercise where the applicant says, hey, I considered them, but you don't know what they considered, why they considered it, why that solution wasn't the appropriate one. So there needs to be more transparency, more informed information provided, more explanation provided for what was considered, what the need is, as Ken said, what is the need you're trying to solve, what was considered, what were the alternatives considered, and how did you come about your selection process? And it's not just utilities. I'll say this, that I know the report focuses on local upgrades, but this is for regional projects as well. The regional planners need to have more transparency about their decision-making so we understand how the regional projects are being picked through the pipeline. MISO does a great job at this. They issue a scorecard after their competitive planning process that tells you what metrics did they use to select their projects. I haven't seen that for other RTOs yet, and that should be a best practice that others are also integrating.
Yeah, and I'm going to follow. It's good I'm following after Anjali, even though I'm a middle child as well. I tell you this, that from our perspective in PJM, we have tried and gone down a lot of these paths, and there's a lot of dead ends, and there's a lot of reasons for that. You can see it, and first, I would say that with Anjali's point about transparency, I think that is the number one. Give stakeholders, give others the opportunity to help to provide accountability here. But it also has to be meaningful, and that's kind of a loaded term, because that in certain dockets, PJM and transmission orders would say what we have as meaningful transparency, and we do not think if I can only get the sticker price on a project and that's it, that's meaningful. And I think we need to have the ability to have transparency that we can engage on. And for the consumer advocates, we've looked to have consultants, hire a consultant to help us with this. But if all we can do is ask questions and not get any answers, I don't know what a consultant could do for us. So it's one thing that we've always struggled with is not just transparency, but the ability to engage and take action from it. And really one of the fundamental problems that we have in this area, and this kind of goes on to your list of items, is the traditional roles of, there's such a traditional role of the transmission owner in this area and what they do, and even to the point of the trust that goes to them. Oh, well, they are giving us information, it must be accurate. There's no ability to do anything with that, and there's such reliance upon that. It's very hard, and this is the way things have always been. Really makes it hard to kind of look at expanding CPCN jurisdiction and those things. And that also goes with, which I think is somewhat of a non-starter after thinking about it for years, is adding more staff. I just don't see the states or federal government or even PJM to a degree adding more staff to do a lot of this. So it really kind of comes down to letting other people help with the accountability. And with that said, I do think one of the two ones I've gravitated to as proposals is the ITM. Having that independent transmission monitor who can ask the questions, who has the ability to see the information that we can't see as the public. Some of it's confidential information. That would make a tremendous difference to have that ability for somebody to be focused on this. The other one, what seems to be more and more in play, is competition. I think that the ability to have other, not just interested like stakeholders, but other interested parties competing on this stuff brings a level of transparency in and of itself that has been very helpful to us in our region. I think those are some of the easiest fixes at this point. And I would say lastly that looking at Order 1920, something that FERC just did to create more transparency, more planning at the regional level. I don't see how it helps consumers and address this massive issue. So that's a real frustration that here we had this huge Order 1920 and trying to provide more regional projects, yet it seemed to almost expand the gray area with the right sizing ROFR, the right of first refusals, that will make it even harder to do regional projects in some ways. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so Claire, I do want to just finally, because no one else brought it up, and I was leaving it for anybody else. The FERC has to do something on this presumption of prudence. It makes absolutely no sense that these entities whose profit is a function of investment, to let them make investment at will without any economic review. We've talked here about transparency and all these things. There is a massive information asymmetry that exists where these are the entities that know whether or not their investment was prudent. Nobody has that information, so it's effectively impossible. It really, as a practical matter, impossible for anybody else to come in and challenge the prudency of those, because we just don't have any evidence of the prudency. That's why applicants in cases have burdens of proof. They're the ones that are asking for something, and the fact that FERC presumes that because a utility made an investment, it is prudent. Puts the burden back on everyone else to have to prove why it isn't. And that's just inconsistent with the economic incentives that utilities have to maximize their investment, and frankly, as firms, to maximize profit. And so I have now 3 FERC chairmen in a row have attempted to pitch just getting rid of the presumption of prudence, and every single time, the response is something like, there's just no way that FERC has the resources to go back and do stated rate cases for all transmission investment, especially in the last 30 years, the way FERC regulated transmission looks relative to what it used to be when utilities did stated rate cases. And so I do think that there's some onus on FERC to go back and look at what makes sense, what sort of threshold does make sense to say, these types of projects we're content. There are some sort of safeguards in place that the utilities aren't going to take advantage of it. And we are going to allow these formula rates and this presumption of prudence to continue. But these over here, you all need to come in and give us some information before you start recovering costs for them. And that might be a voltage threshold That might be Commissioner Christie has talked about whether or not a project has gone over or gone under a certain amount of scrutiny at the state level. That might be projects get the presumption of prudence if it was regionally planned. But what we have right now is just really setting a terrible precedent for utilities to put their money in the safest and least efficient. That's really the Venn diagram we have, investments that are out there, and that's not helping consumers at all.
Yeah, and I'd pile onto that with I really like the way that you phrased it as regional first, because we build the system with the biggest blocks and then fill in with smaller blocks will be more efficient than if we're building as much of the smallest stuff as possible and then looking what's needed on the long term. And I think part of the issue with prudence reviews, going to what Kent was saying, is the energy industry is traditionally very reactive. We look at prudence after the projects are built, when the costs are already sunk. And then at that point, regulators are, it's puts them in a bad spot to ask them to deny recovery, because they have to balance public good with the utility's interests in being economically viable. We may disagree often with folks about what is enough, because it seems like sometimes nothing is enough, but that is the regulator's role. And so if we're not reviewing these projects beforehand, before they are developed, then it's almost like we've lost the race or the battle. That review really needs to occur upfront, and we need to plan regionally. So this is a vestige of this idea of being reactive and reviewing prudence has been a vestige of the old school way of how utilities function, where they had their monopoly footprint. They served that footprint with generation, transmission, distribution. You could look at all aspects of the industry and figure out what was the most cost effective. Well, it's become clear that that is not cost effective. That's like living on an island where things are really expensive. We get better cost effectiveness by being electrically interconnected to our neighbors, by being able to import power during bad extreme weather events, by being able to import power when the sun's shining in one place and not in the other. So it's important that we keep these electrical interconnections, but that also means we need to plan on a more regional basis than we have been doing in the past. And it's flipping the culture of how we plan and how we look at projects.
And Claire, I would add this. One thing I do like is that you're putting out this list of items, and I kind of copied it on my other screen, because this is a newer problem, at least in the PJM region, because in about 2012 was when when FERC ordered more competition in transmission, and that kind of led to a point where you can see it in the cost spend and expenditure charts that really the transmission owners said, okay, we're going to avoid that competition on those regional projects, and we're going to go to a local project. So the significant spend went to the local at that point. So this really got highlighted, these issues, over the last decade. And now we're at this point also where we're, as Anjali was saying, we're really expanding the grid and looking at new needs for the grid. So there's a whole nother need for this. So looking at all options is incredibly important, and really trying to get a traditional way we've done things and look at a new future, just because of the way our regulatory world has changed the landscape in the last decade.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for those great answers. I feel like we touched all different sides of the solution set. I want to introduce a question from our audience now. So someone asked, FERC had declined to establish independent transmission monitors in Order 1920. And this, Greg, I know you brought up this idea. We talked about it in the report. Is that idea fully dead in the water, or how else might we expect that to move forward? So if any of you have any perspectives on that, would love to hear them.
I'll start because at CAPS we have been exploring it. I have been exploring it in different ways. Obviously, it would be best if it was done through FERC, because then there's a lot more authority that would be given to that transmission monitor position, in particular, an ease in getting confidential information, more requirements and expectations of what type of information they can get. But even from I would call that behind the curtain. Even in front of the curtain, if the consumer advocates of PJM States CAPS or some other entity or entities have the ability to have that transmission monitor, even if it's just in our PJM region, to help us ask questions, figure out what information we have, try and ask for more and kind of point out where there are gaps would be significant. In a lot of ways, I do that on a very higher 10,000 foot level because that's about as close as I can get on transmission items. But I know that transmission monitor would help. So we have explored it on different avenues, and the advocates are completely frustrated that we couldn't get a transmission monitor that may cost $1 million or so to help us with these billions of dollars of expenditure that we have no input on. It doesn't make sense to us why that wouldn't happen. So we certainly haven't given up on that, at least in our region.
I think that the ITM idea is the base of the idea of we need assistance, or we need independent entities that can look at what projects are coming through. Are they considering appropriate alternatives? Are the costs appropriate? Are they staying on budget? There's lots of different things that an ITM can do. And part of the issue is that there wasn't necessarily agreement among those who had offered the initial idea of an ITM as to what they wanted that role to do. Second is that the phrase monitor has some history behind it in the energy industry. And so whether it's called an ITM or a transmission advocate or some other position, it is important to have this third-party review role out there looking out for the benefit of the customers. In part, also, there's an issue in PJM region, and Kent and I, when we were advocates, we're so lucky to have Greg as head of CAPS, because most advocate offices, most regulatory agencies are very strapped for resources, and you don't have time to go into review every single transmission project that is being proposed or the cost of every project. And so it's important to have resources out there that can help the public entities that are supposed to be protecting the public interests and understanding what is happening. And I know your report, Claire, covers transmission authorities. That's a way for states to potentially create some sort of transmission monitor within their area. Some states didn't create a new resource. They consolidated all their transmission oversight into one resource, like New York's Rapid Act consolidated everything into one agency. Whether you consolidate into an existing agency, creating a transmission authority, creating an ITM, I think there's lots of ways to skin this cat, but the need for independent review remains.
Yeah, I would just say, I don't know that it's dead. I don't know that the ITM, this is a little bit Anjali's to what she said, but I don't know that it means the same thing to everybody. This isn't Potter Stewart's discussion about pornography, that it's when you see it. I don't think there's agreement across the board as to what the function of an ITM would be. I do think there's broad agreement, especially amongst consumer groups and commissions, that there's a need that could be addressed by this additional entity or this additional advocate or whoever it may be. I do think, though, there's some valid argument that what we're really saying is the institutions we have right now aren't doing their job, and so we need to create a new institution to do their job for them. And it seems that is a frustrating thing for me to just fully sign on to. Not that I completely agree with the problem statement, but it's just that, the first solution should always be people doing their jobs to begin with. And there is a role for states through changes in legislation. And also, Greg has given up on state PUCs getting more resources. I haven't yet. but I think there's at least an acknowledgement that I've never met a state commission that just has too many people sitting around for the work that they have or the tasks that they have to assign to them. I do, however, think, regardless of whether state PUCs have enough resources, there are certain things that can only be done at the regional or wholesale level that are under the jurisdiction of FERC. We talk about more efficient regional transmission and multi-state benefits of all these different things. Though you can't plan regional transmission through a state-by-state integrated resource planning process. You just can't. It never aligns. It's not going to add up. It's not going to be as efficient as a regional transmission planning process that can approve and plan and site transmission, not specifically permit, but at least determine efficient transmission across an entire region or even between regions, never mind across regions. And so there's a role for FERC to play. And effectively up to this point, it is the old Ronco chicken rotisserie thing that through Order 1000, for instance, FERC just set it and forget it and walked away. And whatever shortcomings, Greg thinks that 1920 has, I can tell you I don't know whether it will be a success, but I can tell you it will not be a success in the way that FERC intends it to be if they don't focus on implementation and making sure that it works. Because with Order 1000, they set the rules and effectively walked away. And what we've been left with is people just completely focusing, instead of on Order 1000 projects, focusing exclusively on this regional thing. So an ITM could help provide additional information, but if FERC's unwilling to do anything about that additional information, I don't know what it's going to add up to.
Just want to add one thing to that whether or not FERC acts, regions can create this kind of function on their own. Again, looking at potentially existing resources or ones that need to be created, but as far as I know, there's no tariff that has provisions in it that would prevent such an oversight function from happening. It might need to be cordoned within the tariff rules. Of course, it needs to be cordoned within existing tariff rules, but there are ways to accomplish some of these objectives if there's willingness within the regions to increase transparency and willingness within regulators, as Kent said, to do their job fully and resources to do their job fully, and utilities to share information, and advocates to consider the information and not necessarily say no at the first instance, but really look at it and see, is this right? Can we trust that this is the right selection? So changes can be made to reach that same goal within the existing confines of the tariff, even if FERC doesn't act, but it's always much easier if the directions come from FERC when it comes to transmission.
All right. I'm going to ask another audience question, and it'll be interesting to see if you all have any examples for this. So an audience member asked, are there any states that are currently doing good things with respect to oversight of local transmission projects, i.e. examples we could look to when advocating for legislative changes, etc.? We have a couple of case study examples in our report, so I'll plug to go download our report and look for those. But any ideas come to mind from our panelists?
I do. Well, it'll be interesting because one of them is Kentucky. I think that the one that we did look at trying to create legislation for different states to utilize if they could, and one of them is Virginia. Virginia is very involved and has a lot more authority than most in the PJM region. For example, there are some states that have no authority to look at these projects, none for certain these local regional projects. Other states have limited authority, and that's where you see most of the area where the build-out is coming. And then you have some states that have a lot of authority. So there are, I think Virginia is one of them, and I think Kentucky is where it's at. But the issue with Kentucky is that they're in a more of a regional transmission cost allocation subset of PJM, which is the AEP territories. There's I think 7 states in the AEP PJM regions, and they all share costs So if you have a state like Indiana has no authority and they build a lot of projects, you're getting your share of that in Kentucky and Michigan and Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, based on your load allocation. And so that kind of defeats a little bit of it. But Virginia was one of them, I recall. But Ken, I know I prompted you a little bit with
Yeah,
that.
no, it becomes a race to the bottom. So I mean, to be clear, so Kansas has done some unique things, and I think the report talks about that, where they've tried to provide that positive incentive. It does. You run the risk. We got rid of the Public Utility Holding Act, and now we've got all these multi-state utilities over time, and that's a double-edged sword. You certainly get efficiencies from joining up and only having one CEO and one controller, and not having to pay one call center. Like there are real efficiencies of utility mergers, but when you start having multi-state jurisdictions, it really is a double-edged sword on some of these things. And so you can get a race to the bottom if you have some jurisdictions within these multi-state utilities that are really holding utilities accountable, because the utility says, okay, well, same thing with the regional, what we talked about in the report, the regional planning is they go, okay, well, we're just going to go put our investment. We got a limited amount of money. We're going to go put it in the states that don't ask us a bunch of questions. So there can really be I say a harm. There can really be concerns with being the with being the strict one when you're in that scenario, because people may put their money somewhere else where it's less riskier. They get asked less questions. So really, the states that are doing well. How do I say this? This has largely been an RTO problem, because a lot of states change their legislation when their utilities joined RTOs in anticipation that FERC and RTOs were going to play a role that we have now found they do not play. And so this has come up with where there was a presumption that FERC, whether it was ever true or not, legislators believed it to be true, that they thought FERC and the RTO were going to be looking at these high voltage projects, and high is a relative term, but a lot of these states completely got rid of oversight by the PUC of 100 kV and below or 200 kV and below. And so the states that are doing it well, ironically, at least the oversight of local planning projects, are either the ones that joined RTOs late and didn't get convinced to change their legislation, or that haven't joined RTOs. But the irony is, the ones that haven't joined RTOs, their states still have, for the most part, the exact same authority they've always had. Their PUCs have the exact same level of oversight, but they're not doing regional planning particularly well. So their customers, their PUCs have full oversight over the local stuff, but they're not getting any of the benefit of regional transmission planning. And then in the RTOs, you've got utilities that you've got regional planners that want to plan these regional projects. And frankly, you have utilities instead putting as much capital as they can into the local thing. And so it becomes this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. But I do think there's an opportunity with the lessons learned over the last decade plus that some of these states should consider going back to the old way of saying, look, we're going to have dual oversight. Because there is no one at the federal level doing anything about this. And so we're going to make sure that our retail regulators are looking at this, even though there might be some wholesale rate recovery implications. So I think the states that are doing it the old way are probably doing it, quote, best, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think along that same line, some of the single state RTOs have gotten better, like New York and California have gotten better policies in place, in part because they just have to deal with themselves, but it still has that same issue of intra-regional capacity is potentially lower in those areas and is wanting. The other thing I would say with RTO states or even non-RTO states where you have companies that span utilities or utilities that span states, so one company has a footprint in 4 different states, you could plan on a regional basis there, even though there's multiple utilities. It's just not happening as much. And so states should put in place policies that help them support the regional planning process. So policies that give their regulators and consumer advocates and others resources so they can participate in the regional planning process. Policies that help them plan what their transmission needs are for their citizens, but that can then feed into the assumptions that go into developing the regional plan, because no state can do it alone. So all the policies should be supportive of developing a regional plan. And then also policies that force some transparency at the RTO level would be helpful, because as Greg mentioned earlier, they're not public entities. And so they aren't subject to the same FOIA, Sunshine Act, discovery regulations that other entities are.
Great. All right, well, with that, I am going to draw us to a close. I want to thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar on our new report. We're so thrilled to share this important work with you, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists for taking the time to join us today. We have been recording this session, and the recording will be posted on the event page, the same one you used to register for the webinar, within 24 hours, along with links where you can download the slide deck and the full report. The QR code on the screen right now will take you straight to that event page that you can bookmark and return to as resources are added over the next day or so. And if you have any follow-up questions for us, my email is on the screen and I would love to be in touch. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful day.